The Soviet Union remains one of the most misunderstood political entities of the 20th century. Shrouded in layers of propaganda from both sides of the Iron Curtain, distorted by Cold War rhetoric, and mythologized by those who never lived through its contradictions. For decades, the West painted it as a totalitarian monolith, where freedom was non-existent and suffering universal, while Soviet propaganda machinery worked tirelessly to project an image of socialist paradise, where equality reigned and the working class lived in dignity. The truth, as always, lies somewhere far more complex, far more human, and far more documented than either narrative allows. What follows is not speculation or ideology, but a careful examination of 5 persistent myths about the USSR. Myths that continue to shape how we understand not only Soviet history, but the entire trajectory of the 20th century. These are not abstract debates, but concrete realities that affected hundreds of millions of lives across 11 time zones and 7 decades of tumultuous existence. The first myth we must confront is perhaps the most persistent in Western imagination: that religion was completely eradicated in the Soviet Union, that the atheist state successfully purged all traces of faith from its vast territories, leaving behind only party doctrine and materialist philosophy. The reality was far more complicated and reveals much about the limits of totalitarian control, even in a system designed for total ideological conformity. When Vladimir Lenin consolidated power after the October Revolution of 1917, he made his position unmistakably clear. "We must fight religion," he declared, and this became the foundational principle of Soviet cultural policy for generations. The Bolsheviks viewed religion as the opium of the masses, a tool of oppression wielded by the old Tsarist regime to keep the peasantry docile and the working class subservient. In January 1918, barely months after seizing control, the Soviet government issued a decree separating the Orthodox Church from the state. This was not merely symbolic. Overnight, the Church lost its authority to register marriages, births, and deaths. These functions were transferred to newly created civil bodies of the Soviet republics, effectively stripping the Church of its administrative power over the population's most intimate life events. What followed was a campaign of staggering brutality and scope. Churches across the Soviet Union were systematically destroyed or repurposed into warehouses, museums, and community centers. The great cathedrals of Moscow and Leningrad saw their bells melted down, their icons confiscated, their priests imprisoned or executed. In Central Asia and the Caucasus, mosques were closed en masse, their minarets silenced, their madrasas shuttered. By the 1930s, the assault on religious infrastructure had reached industrial proportions. Yet here is where myth diverges sharply from reality. Despite this ferocious campaign, religion was never formally banned in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Constitution itself, that document which supposedly enshrined the principles of scientific socialism, contained a remarkable clause guaranteeing citizens freedom of conscience, that is, the right to profess any religion or not to profess any, to participate in religious cults or conduct atheistic propaganda. This was not mere window dressing. Millions of Soviet citizens continued to practice their faith in private, baptizing their children in secret, observing religious holidays behind closed doors, and maintaining traditions that stretched back centuries before Marxism-Leninism was even conceived. The state's relationship with religion underwent a dramatic shift during the crucible of World War II. In 1943, with Nazi armies deep inside Soviet territory and the survival of the state hanging by a thread, Joseph Stalin made a calculated decision. He authorized the restoration of the Moscow Patriarchate and created the Council for the Affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church. This was pragmatism at its most naked. Stalin recognized that Russian Orthodox Christianity was deeply woven into the national identity, that soldiers fought more fiercely when they believed God was on their side, and that the church could be a tool of mobilization rather than merely an obstacle to be destroyed. From that point forward, the Soviet state officially acknowledged the existence of Orthodox believers. Churches remained open, though their numbers were carefully controlled. Priests operated under constant surveillance, and many were informants for the KGB. Atheist propaganda continued unabated in schools, workplaces, and media, but believers were not banned from attending services. They simply faced social consequences, career limitations, and the constant pressure of a society that officially deemed their convictions obsolete. This created a strange duality where babushkas filled churches on Easter while their grandchildren recited Lenin's speeches in school, where faith persisted in the shadows of a supposedly atheist empire. The second myth cuts to the heart of communist ideology itself, that the USSR was a land of total equality, where class distinctions had been abolished, and every worker enjoyed the same standard of living regardless of position or privilege. This was the promise of the revolution, the dream that animated millions who believed they were building a new world. Karl Marx had written that the communist future would operate according to the principle from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And this slogan was plastered on posters, repeated in speeches, and taught to school children as the inevitable destiny of socialist society. The reality was starkly different from the moment the Bolsheviks took power. Social disparity existed from the very beginning, not as an aberration, but as a structural feature of Soviet life. The housing crisis provides perhaps the clearest window into this inequality. In the aftermath of revolution and civil war, Soviet cities were desperately overcrowded. Multiple families shared single apartments, with communal kitchens and bathrooms becoming the norm. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the few. The state promised to solve this through central planning, but mass construction of housing only began in earnest under Nikita Khrushchev after Stalin's death in 1953. The famous Khrushchevka apartment blocks, those 5-story prefabricated concrete structures that still dominate the skylines of former Soviet cities, were built rapidly and cheaply to house the urban working class. Even these modest apartments were difficult to obtain. Unlike in capitalist societies where housing could be purchased on the open market, Soviet apartments were allocated by the state based on a complex system of waiting lists, workplace seniority, and political connections. A factory worker might wait years or even decades for an apartment, living in cramped communal housing while raising a family. The apartments themselves were small, often poorly constructed, and lacked amenities that were standard in the West. Meanwhile, high-ranking Communist Party officials lived in entirely different circumstances. The nomenklatura, that privileged class of party functionaries, military officers, and industrial managers, enjoyed spacious apartments in desirable neighborhoods, access to special stores stocked with goods unavailable to ordinary citizens, and dachas in the countryside where they could escape the urban grind. This was not equality, but a new form of hierarchy, one based not on ownership of capital, but on proximity to political power. The same pattern repeated across every aspect of Soviet life. Buying a car was a privilege that required not just money, but connections and patience. The waiting list for a Lada or Moskvich could stretch for years, and even then, the vehicle you received might be poorly assembled, prone to breakdowns, and impossible to repair without black market parts. Furniture, appliances, and consumer goods followed the same logic. The state controlled production and distribution, and those with access to power enjoyed access to goods. The myth of equality was maintained through propaganda and enforced through silence about the privileges of the elite. But anyone living in the Soviet Union understood the reality. Some were more equal than others, to borrow Orwell's famous phrase, and the gap between the nomenclatura and the ordinary worker was vast, even if it was never officially acknowledged. The third myth concerns Soviet healthcare, often cited by both critics and defenders of the Soviet system as either a model of socialist achievement or a cautionary tale of government incompetence. The truth, as usual, resists simple categorization. The USSR did indeed create a healthcare system that was free at the point of service for all citizens, a genuine accomplishment in a country that had been overwhelmingly rural and medically underserved before the revolution. By 1975, the Soviet Union boasted an impressive statistic: 32 medical workers for every 10,000 citizens, compared to only 21 in the United States. This numerical advantage was touted as proof of socialism's superiority, evidence that a planned economy could deliver services more efficiently than the chaotic, profit-driven systems of the West. But numbers tell only part of the story, and often the least important part. The vast majority of these medical workers were not highly trained physicians, but nurses and paramedics with minimal education. Soviet medical schools graduated doctors in enormous numbers, but the quality of training was often poor, and the profession was poorly paid, which discouraged talented students from pursuing it. The result was a healthcare system that was universal in access, but deeply uneven in quality. Waiting times for surgery were measured not in days or weeks, but in months. Hospitals were chronically overbooked, with patients lying on gurneys in hallways for lack of beds. Surgical procedures were delayed due to shortages of qualified personnel and equipment. The Soviet medical system was designed for mass treatment of infectious diseases and workplace injuries, areas where it performed reasonably well, but it struggled with complex surgeries, chronic conditions, and specialized care. Moreover, the principle of universal health care applied only in theory. In practice, a parallel system existed for the privileged. The Ministry of Defense operated its own hospitals and sanatoriums for military personnel. The Ministry of Transportation had its own medical facilities for railway and aviation workers. Most significantly, high-ranking Communist Party officials had access to exclusive clinics with the best equipment, the most experienced doctors, and access to imported medicines unavailable to ordinary citizens. These facilities were hidden from public view, their existence an open secret that everyone knew but no one discussed openly. For the average Soviet citizen, navigating the healthcare system often required more than just showing up. Bribery was commonplace and sometimes necessary to receive timely care. Patients brought gifts to doctors and nurses, bottles of expensive vodka or cognac, envelopes of cash, or hard-to-find consumer goods. This informal economy of favors and payments existed alongside the official system of free healthcare, a shadow market that acknowledged what the propaganda could not, that scarcity created inequality and inequality created corruption. The Soviet healthcare system kept people alive, reduced infant mortality, and controlled epidemic diseases, achievements that should not be dismissed. But it was far from the model of socialist efficiency that propaganda claimed, and its failures were felt most acutely by those without connections or resources to navigate its bureaucracy. The fourth myth is perhaps the most culturally resonant and the most misunderstood: the famous declaration that there is no sex in the USSR. This phrase emerged during a 1986 television broadcast, a joint Soviet-American discussion where a Soviet woman, confronted with questions about sexual freedom, responded with this now infamous line. The statement was meant to convey that Soviet citizens, guided by high moral standards and political consciousness, did not engage in sex as mere recreation or pastime. It suggested that Soviet love was pure, romantic, and directed toward the higher purpose of building communism and raising the next generation of Soviet citizens. This image was carefully cultivated through Soviet cinema, where romantic relationships were depicted as chaste, emotionally intense, and ultimately subordinate to collective goals. Watching classic Soviet films, one might conclude that Soviet people fell in love deeply, but expressed that love through longing glances and passionate declarations rather than physical intimacy. This was the ideal that the state promoted, the image of the new Soviet man and woman whose desires were channeled toward productive and socially beneficial ends. Reality, of course, was nothing like this sanitized version. Sexual life in the Soviet Union was as varied, complicated, and messy as anywhere else. Though it was forced underground by official prudishness and lack of public discourse. Sex scandals involving high-profile officials and athletes periodically erupted, quickly suppressed, but widely discussed in whispers. In the early years after the revolution, before Stalin consolidated power and imposed conservative social norms, there was actually a brief but intense sexual revolution. Bolshevik theorists like Alexandra Kollontai advocated for free love and the abolition of traditional marriage, arguing that these were bourgeois institutions that oppressed women. For a few years in the 1920s, Soviet society experimented with radical ideas about sexuality. Divorce became easy to obtain, abortion was legalized, and communal child-rearing was proposed as an alternative to the nuclear family. This experiment was short-lived. By the 1930s, Stalin had reversed course, reinstating traditional family values, criminalizing abortion, and making divorce difficult. Homosexuality, which had been decriminalized after the revolution, was recriminalized in 1934, with male homosexual acts punishable by up to 5 years in labor camps. This remained law until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, forcing gay men to live in constant fear of arrest and persecution. Lesbians, while not explicitly criminalized, faced social ostracism and had no legal recognition or protection. In the 1960s, the hippie movement reached the Soviet Union, bringing with it ideals of sexual freedom and countercultural rebellion. Soviet hippies, known as Sistema, gathered in parks and communal apartments, listened to smuggled Western rock music, and experimented with relationships outside the bounds of official morality. The KGB monitored these groups closely, occasionally arresting members for parasitism or hooliganism, but the movement persisted throughout the Brezhnev era. Contraception was another area where Soviet reality lagged far behind Western standards. Condoms were poorly made and difficult to find even in major cities. The birth control pill was not widely available, and as a result, abortion became the primary form of birth control, with Soviet women undergoing multiple abortions over their lifetimes, often in conditions that were medically substandard. This created a public health crisis that was never openly discussed, but affected millions of women. So yes, there was sex in the USSR, but it existed in a context of official denial, inadequate health care, legal persecution of non-heterosexual relationships, and a lack of public education about sexual health. The myth of Soviet sexual purity was just that, a myth maintained through censorship and silence, while real people navigated desire and intimacy as best they could under difficult circumstances. The fifth and final myth concerns the quality of Soviet goods, a topic that touches on the fundamental promise of the communist system, that central planning would eliminate the waste and inefficiency of capitalism and provide high-quality products to meet the needs of the population. Soviet propaganda regularly claimed that Soviet-made goods were superior to their Western counterparts, that Soviet workers took pride in their labor and produced items built to last. Unlike the disposable consumer culture of the capitalist world, for those who lived through the Soviet era, This claim ranged from bitterly ironic to outright laughable. The reality was that Soviet goods were often shoddily made, in short supply, and inferior to Western equivalents. In 1963, the State Trade Inspection conducted a review of Soviet manufacturing and found that 68% of all bicycles produced failed to meet official quality standards. More than a third of furniture, 34.7%, was similarly substandard. These were not isolated problems, but systemic failures that reflected the deeper dysfunctions of the planned economy. Without competition or profit motive, Soviet factories had little incentive to improve quality. Managers were judged on meeting production quotas, not on whether the products actually worked or lasted. This created perverse incentives where factories would rush to meet numerical targets while ignoring quality control, knowing that consumers had no alternative suppliers to turn to. In 1965, senior party officials, including Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin, held discussions about the necessity of implementing state quality control for all produced goods, an admission that the existing system had failed. Reforms were proposed, some implemented, but the fundamental problems persisted. Shortages were a defining feature of Soviet consumer life. Basic items like cheese, sausages, and meat were often unavailable in state stores, forcing people to stand in long queues whenever word spread that a shipment had arrived. Chewing gum, brightly colored clothing, and children's footwear were luxury items that parents struggled to obtain. One Soviet citizen recalled that a shortage of basic cheeses, sausages, meat, and ordinary chewing gum, and brightly colored clothes and footwear for children was a sensitive issue that created constant stress and frustration. Geography mattered enormously in determining access to goods. Moscow and Leningrad, the showcase cities of the Soviet Union, had better stocked stores and occasional access to imported items. Foreign goods, when they appeared, were highly prized and often acquired through connections or the black market. In provincial cities and towns across the vast Soviet interior, the situation was far worse. Many areas did not see quality consumer goods until the collapse of the USSR in 1991, when the opening of borders and the rise of foreign trade finally brought imported products to previously isolated regions. The myth of Soviet quality was maintained through propaganda that highlighted showcase factories and model workers, while ignoring the everyday reality of broken appliances, ill-fitting clothes, and unreliable vehicles. Soviet citizens developed elaborate strategies for coping with these shortages, building networks of personal connections called blat to access goods, hoarding items when they became available, and learning to repair things themselves since replacement parts were often impossible to find. This created a culture of making do, of resourcefulness born from necessity. But it also represented a massive waste of human time and energy that could have been directed toward more productive ends. These 5 myths, when examined closely, reveal a broader truth about the Soviet Union that transcends simple judgments of success or failure, good or evil. The USSR was a vast experiment in social engineering, an attempt to remake human society according to ideological principles, and like all such experiments, it produced outcomes far more complex than its architects intended. Religion persisted despite decades of suppression because faith answers needs that ideology cannot. Inequality emerged in a system designed to eliminate it because human societies naturally stratify around power and access to resources. Healthcare became universal but uneven because good intentions cannot overcome scarcity and poor planning. Sexual life continued despite official denial because human desire cannot be legislated away. And consumer goods remained poor quality because centralized control lacks the feedback mechanisms that markets provide. The legacy of these contradictions shapes the former Soviet space even today, more than 3 decades after the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. Understanding these myths and the realities behind them is not an academic exercise, but a necessary reckoning with how ideology intersects with human nature, how systems shape lives, and how the gap between promise and reality can persist for generations before finally collapsing under its own weight.